Conspirinormal.
Welcome to Conspirinormal, guys. We are back. We had an interesting show last time, and we have another interesting show this time.
Across the pond.
Across the pond, yes, with our good friend Marc Anthony Wyatt. And he has a new book out called The Spirit of Cornwall. Actually, he has two books out called The Spirit of Cornwall, and we're going to talk about the first book on this episode. And later on, in probably about a month or so, we're going to do one on the second book. But Marc, welcome back to Conspirinormal, man.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, Serfield. Good to be back.
Yeah.
Thanks for inviting me back.
Thank you, sir. It's always great to have you. And you were here back in October for our Strange Realities conference, which we enjoyed having you.
It was amazing. I loved it.
Yeah, I put you on first. You got to start it all out.
You set the bar low, I know. just to encourage the rest, I know.
No,
I was a warm-up act
Yeah,
while people were still getting comfortable.
Yeah, you did a great job. You really did. We were glad to have you, and hey, it got it over with early for you, so you were able to enjoy it.
I was a little bit jet lagged actually, and I was a bit nervous.
Yeah,
but, I tried to cram too much into an hour as well. Mixing up two stories that maybe I shouldn't have done. But it's all experience.
Yeah, well, gives you that experience, and it looks like you're picking up some more speaking engagements here pretty soon.
Yes, I've got in October the Cornwall UFO Research Group, which is sort of just up the road from where I am now in West Cornwall, a place called Truro. And that's been running for, I'd have to check, but I think it's about 30 odd years. A guy called David Gillam set it up just after a sighting, which is actually in the book. I think it's in the second volume. I'm not sure. I'm probably going to do the same talk, but I'm developing it a bit further now, sort of getting deeper into it.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
That'll be quite a big one, actually. Usually he gets about 300 people.
Oh, wow.
So I should be a bit nervous before that one, yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. He's got a reputation for getting people in that are it's weird. I mean, every year I go to it, I see the names that come up, and usually they're not people I know. They're not sort of public, big names. And I sometimes think, I don't know if this is going to be any good, because I just don't know about them. And they always, sort of 90 times out of 100, they pleasantly surprise you, with some amazing, just sort of sideways look at this phenomena, So,
Yeah, we gave you a nice little warm up to get to that. I think when you did your presentation at our conference, I think we had like maybe 20 people there at that point. So this will be a little bit more.
I know. I'm told I'm supposed to sort of the best people evidently get eye contact with as many people as possible to make them feel engaged.
Yeah.
And that sounds great on paper, but I'm basically quite a shy guy, really, and I've got to get over that because it's not. I think I've just got to be an actor when I'm up there. That's the only way I can do it.
Just imagine them all as being naked.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, that's right.
The old trick.
So, right. Marc, you've been working on these books now for 2 or 3 years, I think. That you first sent me a copy of it, or like an early copy of it a couple years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it's totally, as you know, it's totally changed from where it started, really.
Yeah, it's totally different.
I was sort of living and breathing it for a long time. And I mentioned earlier on the messenger chat we had, but it's almost like, you're into music as well. If you get like a singer-songwriter, for example, who's coming up through as a kid, teenager, and he's having all these sort of early experiences, and he's writing all these songs. You'll often find that the ones who really make it, their first album is like a look back at those early years. It's like that person, that man or woman, has got years of stories to draw from, almost, for their music. And they then put that out. And then, of course, the second follow-up album is a difficult one, because they're suddenly left with, they've been through all their stuff,
They're not as hungry.
Yeah. So you often find that the first album is the best album with, many people. And I think it's the same. Well, hopefully this isn't going to be my best one, but it's okay. I'm happy with it, but hope I can get better as I go, But this, as you know, it tied in so many things that I love, not just paranormal. It was looking at culture in Cornwall, the history of Cornwall, and has philosophical bits thrown in all over the place, because these are all the things that I sort of like to think about and read about and talk about. And I just thought that I could combine it all, because I felt that it was connected. And to explain that, you'd have to read the whole book. But Cornwall attracts creative people from outside. So, historically, it always has. We've had artists and musicians. In recent years, we had, not that recent now, we had Donovan down in the 60s. So it wasn't recently. Just proves how old I am. So, and the landscape itself, the land that they're walking on, that they're living on, is somehow sort of infused into their work, whether that's, an artist sort of sculpting a piece of granite or somebody writing music like Donovan. It's the same result. And I think there's a connection there between that, what's making the creativity and the sort of paranormal side, because it's all sort of interrelated. So yeah, sorry, I'm sort of rabbiting on. You've left to interject.
Well, Marc, how did you go about with this kind of compiling these stories? Like what brought your interest into talking about kind of the folklore and kind of the paranormal events that happen in Cornwall? And I guess we've never really talked about how you kind of ended up there either. So what brought your interest into all this?
Yeah. Okay. So briefly, I do mention it in the book. My first ever, I won't go into great detail because we never get onto other stuff, but I lived in the southeast of England, but my father had very, very Cornish relations. When I say very, very Cornish, we had sort of like the full-on Cornish names, like Trevorrow and Nicholas and so on. These are all very, very Cornish names from sort of people who've been here since the year dot, as we say. And so it was my first visit in 73, I think it was. And that was like the beginning of it. It's like another country within a country. And you literally cross this bridge on this Brunel, 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 the engineer. That's one of the ways into Cornwall. One of the major ways is to cross this. There's a railway bridge and there's a road bridge alongside each other. And from that first moment going across that bridge, it's like you notice, you can almost feel it. I think most people probably can when they're coming into Cornwall, but you feel a difference. Now, whether that's sort of geological, because there is a lot of granite just before you get to Cornwall on Dartmoor, which is high, barren land, sort of granite everywhere. And then you cross over into Cornwall and you've got a lot more of it, a hell of a lot more of it as you go down. And it gets progressively, it's like a tiny peninsula. And it's about 90 miles long, I think, top of my head. And you're never very far from the sea. You're like 10 minutes drive from the sea, wherever you are, really.
Yeah, from either way. Yeah, it's very narrow.
So it's sort of affected by like the landscape, the granite, and then you've got the sea either side, which, as I say, it tapers down to a point to the piece where I'm at. To the degree that the people who are talking about global warming and the fact that the water level is going to rise and all this sort of stuff in the next 50, 60 years or whatever, some of these people are forecasting that the very tip of Cornwall, which is the piece I'm in, literally just across, is going to be sort of cut off like an island, because the sea is going to rise so much that there's like a little estuary, a place called Hale, sort of 5-minute drive from here, which will rise. And that sort of ties into the legends, because if you go back in time, you can find the legend of Lioness, or Lioness, whichever way you want to say it, which was this land that was supposedly off the coast of the far west of Cornwall, where I am, on the south coast. Well, it was sort of at the end of Land's End. It wrapped around the south coast towards a place called Penzance, which is, I suppose, 15 miles away, something like that. And then on the top end, which is I'm on the top coast now, there are high bits of rock, literally, I can see them from my window during the day here, called, I think it's seven, I probably got it wrong, but there's a series of stones. And that was presumably higher ground at one point. So if you can imagine, the whole of the tip was once surrounded by land, and it was this place called Lioness. And there's a legend that only one man survived it, a man on a white horse. And there's two families that lay claim to it on their coat of arms. One of them's Trevelyan, I can't remember the other one off the top of my head. So yeah, it's all sort of tied into that. That whole thing about Cornwall being a separate country,
having its own kind of distinct culture, and
very much so. Yeah, they don't consider themselves. Well, it depends who you talk to, but most of them don't consider themselves to be English. Really, they consider themselves to be Cornish first and British second, but not English.
What brought your interest into trying to compile these different stories? And we've kind of got a mix going on in this book between the wider array of kind of Cornish folklore and these kind of stories, and then your own personal stories. So what kind of brought your interest into kind of trying to compile this folklore and seeing it as as distinct?
Yeah, it comes back to before I sort of went off on a tangent again about the sort of first album idea.
Right.
But it was something I'd always been interested in since that first visit. So about 1973. My dad, before that time and after that time, always had lots of Cornish literature. When I say literature, I'm not talking about sort of high blown sort of, really posh stuff, I'm just talking to general stuff like Dennis Vell Baker, John Betjeman. He was a poet laureate, actually, so I suppose he does belong to it. I can't remember all the names off the top of my head now. But there's so many of them that came to Cornwall, and they weren't necessarily Cornish, but came to Cornwall and they wrote their stuff down here, inspired by the landscape and so on. And I used to read all that stuff, and because a lot of that stuff was about folklore, like the Lioness story I just said,
right.
About this flooding of this ancient land. And there were stories about mermaids and all this sort of thing, which we can get onto maybe later. But all of that was in these books, and I used to just sit and read. I was a bookworm, just read these books over and over again. I loved all that stuff. And of course, we would start at that point from 73 onwards. We used to go every year, more or less, with my parents. And then as soon as I was sort of independent in my own motor, I was off down there on my own, So, and I've kept that going ever since. So that's, I suppose, 40 odd years now. So it's always been there. And over the years, I've heard so many stories, coming out of Cornwall, the things we mentioned, the mermaids, all this sort of stuff. And the history, obviously I was interested in the history as well. And I just felt like I wanted to combine that creativity angle with, so I didn't want to just put out a book that was just like, here's a list of spooky stories with sort of, because most of these things aren't spooky. They're not scary at all. They're just things that happen to people that people have observed. So, that's it really. It's just always been there. and I just wanted to put it out there, almost like in a similar way to I did the first book, Wyatt's Weird World. It was like a way of putting, sort of drawing a close to it almost, like it's in your head and you want to put it down on paper. And I had this vision of tying it all together, with like the creativity and the paranormal,
right,
and the actual place itself, and bringing it all together. And in the back of my mind, I was always trying to sort of, I didn't consciously think, oh, here's how I'm going to link them. I had this feeling that if I just kept working at it and kept, just putting it out there, and I can't really explain it, my processes, but it would actually create itself. Because I'm very much into that thing that I do believe that we do create, and which I go into in the book. Occasionally, I'm not sure if it's in the second book, but our thoughts create reality, which we know. I mean, literally everything around you somebody was thinking about that at one point, and it became a solid item.
Yeah, from the abstract to the material, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that was that's the way I work. It's just like I sort of learned that, really. I didn't always know that. I sort of picked that up from an old friend who I dedicated the second book to. He's been gone a few years now. And he would often we would have these long, deep conversations, philosophy and politics and what have you. And he would often say to me, when I was sort of trying to understand how something worked, I used to want to know exactly how something worked, like in that sort of engineer's sort of way of thinking. And he used to say to me, take yourself out of the equation. You don't need to understand it. All you need to know is that, you can create it. But stop thinking too hard about it. Just do it. And I think that also ties into, the whole do-it-yourself thing, which I'm into, which is, that whole thing that grew out of punk.
Right.
Which is, don't wait for somebody to give you the opportunity to do something. Yeah. Don't wait to be asked to do something. Go and look for it. Or create your own.
Yeah, do it yourself, right?
Yeah, I'm very, very much into that. I think a lot of my generation, I'm 59, almost 60 now. We grew up well, but it depended. When punk came along, a few of us, not many of us at my age, went with it and enjoyed it, and were influenced by it. And then the rest of us, and I still know a lot of these guys today, same age as me, who they couldn't make that leap. They still stuck with their Pink Floyd and their Genesis and their Supertramp, which is fine. I've got no problem with that. I mean, I've matured enough to know that there's a place for everything. I love
prog rock has its place.
Exactly. I mean, I love it all now.
But there was
it was very much a division.
There was a philosophical break, not just the music.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and. I recently met somebody who I hadn't seen for like 40 odd years, and he said, "I remember you used to be into all that fringy stuff." And I said, "What do you mean by fringy?" He said, "Well, weird music." He said, "You didn't like what everyone else liked." I said, "No, we didn't." It wasn't just me, but we went through all that Clash thing and Undertones and all that when they were still sort of sitting cross-legged, smoking weed at Floyd gigs,
Right.
So we sort of moved on, but
well, that's real inspirational. Now you're kind of putting out there that you're kind of collecting and archiving all these stories related to Cornwall now.
Yes, yeah, and it's when you look around, I was thinking this earlier. There's not that there's hardly anybody in Cornwall doing it really that I know of. I mean, we've got my friend David Gillam, who runs the Cornwall UFO Research Group, but his strength is in organising conferences, and he's very, very knowledgeable about all of this stuff, far more than I ever will be, But he's probably not. Well, he isn't a writer. He'd be the first to admit it. And we've all got our strengths, and that's the point. I think And then it was another friend of mine who died recently, who I'd mentioned a lot in the book, Michael Williams. I mean, he was the man in Cornwall. If you needed to know anything about anything paranormal at all, he was the guy, you know.
Yeah.
But he was very quiet about it. You know, not many people knew about it, really. He had his own sort of niche audience, you know.
And Colin Wilson lived there too. I mean, that's where Colin Wilson
was
yeah. based out of.
Yeah, he was
I'm a big Colin Wilson fan.
Yeah, definitely. He lived at Goran Haven, which is on the south coast.
And since he wrote,
a really good friend of his.
Since he wrote this too, are you being approached? Are you find yourself being approached by a lot of people now who want to tell you their Cornish paranormal stories?
Well, strangely enough, I set up a email in the back of the books, like a new email, and I tried to get on it the other day. I thought, I wonder if anyone has actually contacted me, because it's not my regular email. I thought, well, I better check, you know, because people think I'm rude if I haven't responded, and I couldn't get on it. So I'm still struggling to get on it. So I don't really know in terms of emails anyway, but I have had people approach me and who know about the book, and I've had some. I mean, I was really humbled by the reviews. I mean, you know, you sort of expect a nice review from people you know, and you wonder, do they really like it, or they just, you know, what do they say, blowing smoke up my arse, or whatever they say in America. But
that is the expression.
I did wonder, you know. Yeah, but then I noticed that there were one or two on there from people I just didn't know. And plus I had one from a friend of mine in Springfield, Illinois, who's a retired professor, who's extremely honest, shall we say. And if it had been crap, he would have told me, and he would have probably enjoyed telling me. So, and he gave me a really good review. So I'm hoping that the reviews will get people's attention to, you know, give the books a try. And I'm just trying to get onto the local BBC Radio Cornwall.
Oh, nice, yeah.
And, but I haven't. I sent an email to him 2 days ago. I sort of dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, as they say. You know, I did everything possible to sort of, you know, be polite and introduce myself and all this. And they haven't responded yet. But
it can be hard to get the media interested sometimes. We've experienced that ourselves. So let's talk a little bit of some of these personal stories, Marc. Some of the things that have happened to you, and maybe some other people that are around you. And I'll start with this one's fairly simple. I guess the Buddy Holly song.
Oh yeah, I like that one. I mean, it's just where do I start with this? It's quite the actual happening, if you like, is very small, right at the end, as you saw, and it's a very short chapter, isn't it? It's like 2 or 3 pages, and it basically just gave a background to this old friend of mine called Danny, who I met, I suppose, early 2000s, something like that, when I moved to Bude in North Cornwall, and he was a builder, and he was very loud. He was very, I don't know if it means anything over there, but very sort of cockney, a bit like Michael Caine. So everything he said was very loud, and he was very, very direct, and you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors off. You know, that sort of thing. That's terrible Michael Caine impression. I used to do that quite a lot once. So he was that sort of guy. And I knew it because he became a good friend of mine. He taught me to play very basic guitar back in the day. And he would tell me a few of his stories from when he was younger. By this time, he would have been in his late 50s because he died at 64. And one of his things was he absolutely loved Buddy Holly. I mean, above all else, he liked, you know, I think Marty Wilde and people like that as well, and Eddie Cochran, these sort of people. He loved all that rock and roll thing.
Yeah.
And he was in this Teddy Boy. They called them Teddy Boys. Yeah. They were like really tough guys with big sideburns and like quiffs.
So did he have the hair and everything? Suits. Did he have like that?
I believe so.
Yeah,
I've seen the pictures of it. Yeah. He was involved in things which I really cannot mention on air.
Gotcha.
He was involved in something with, all I'll say is it involved an Italian guy from these are street gangs around London in the 50s after the war, and there was a lot of hostility amongst these guys with the Italians at the time. There isn't now, but there was at the time because of their role in the war with the Germans. And a friend of his had had a nasty experience with an Italian, basically. And it was a terrible thing, and I certainly wouldn't condone it. And he wasn't proud of it, but he was involved in a very, very nasty attack where a copper, local policeman, found them doing what they were doing. That's all I'm going to say. And they said, no, I'm more or less said it now. They said, oh, what's he, and this is a gang of them, nasty gang. They said, oh, what's he doing up there? And they said, oh, well, I've said it now. I said it. No, I'm not going to go any further because it's very, very nasty.
Gotcha.
But basically, the copper turned a blind eye to what they were doing, and he said, well, just make sure he's gone by the morning. The copper had a nasty experience too. And, it was a very rough place, at the edge of London in post-war years,
Right.
You've got to remember a lot of these people had come back from the war and they were, hardened killers, a lot of them, And you can't just switch that off, like as you found out with Vietnam and so on. You can't switch that off. So I knew all of his past, and then he had a sort of much nicer side to him. I mean, he was just tied up in that, but he went off and toured all over America, and he just absolutely loved it. He was a really nice guy, but at the same time, somebody you wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of. He was. He wasn't particularly big. He was just very, very tough, and I would have backed him against more or less anybody, He had hands like the size of shovels, which was quite amusing when he was trying to teach me how to play an A when I first started playing guitar, because he said, what are you doing? Give me the guitar. And he showed me, and he just put a finger over the 3 strings and said, you do it like that. And I said, well, if I do it like that, I've still got 2 strings free. Because he just had such big hands,
Right.
Anyway, so he did all this touring around America, and then they eventually kicked him out because he overstayed his visa welcome. But the whole thing about Buddy Holly was that was like a lifelong passion from the 50s, And nobody quite matched up to Buddy Holly for him, because I remember mentioning the Who to him. Now, the Who arrived in the early 60s, and basically he called them young upstarts or something, which made me laugh, because I'm thinking, well, they're actually quite old, and they were old when he was telling me this,
Right.
And so he just had this attitude. It's like everything stopped after the 50s for him, really, I think, really, in terms of music. So anyway, he used to drive around Bude, and it's a very small town. And he used to drive around with this Buddy Holly. It was nearly always Buddy Holly music, blaring out of his car way too loud. And so you always knew it was him. And you would sort of hear it in the distance, and you'd sort of, oh, Danny's around. And then you'd sort of keep your lookout. And then sure enough, he'd go past you and he'd wave at you, and he'd big smile and his thumbs up out the window. And so that was always a part of him, Now, when he died, and I knew I sort of still know his 2 daughters. And one of his daughters is a very good folk musician, and she was playing, I'm trying to remember what it was now. I think it was True Love Ways or something, at a funeral, over the open, it was an actual burial, because we have a lot of cremations here. This was an actual burial. And as she was playing this song, I mean, I was close enough to see, she was obviously very, very upset. And this is really, it's just an image that'll never leave me. Her tears were running down the fretboard as she was playing, as she was looking over this open grave, as they were lowering him down. And obviously making it even harder to play it, but she still somehow managed to play it like perfectly. And then I think it was a month or so later, the other daughter was at work, and she had this little 2-story building. She was on the top floor, and I think it was a summer or late spring morning, something like this. And she heard Buddy Holly music. Well, it's actually, I think at first she just heard this noise, and then she gradually realised, oh, it's Buddy Holly. She then realised it was because there's just like the one road that passes this office that she's at, and on the other side there's a golf course. There's not much there. Really. It's quite near the sea, and she just instinctively, without really thinking about it at all, because her dad hadn't been gone that long. And I mean, if you've lost a parent, you'll understand this. But when they first go in the first few months or so, you sort of forget that occasionally, and you go to pick the phone up and speak to them, or think, oh, tell mum about that, or whatever,
Sure.
And you can't, And she had one of those moments, and she just basically jumped up from her desk to go and see her dad, because her dad used to regularly go past her office, and he knew, obviously, his daughter where she worked. And he would go past and sort of just wave out the window as he was going by. So she heard this, trying to remember what it was. I think it was Peggy Sue Got Married or something. I can't remember what she said. There's two. There's Peggy Sue and there's Peggy Sue Got Married. It was one of those I seem to remember. And she's standing at the window waiting for him to appear around the corner and just drive that little short stretch. Now, no car came around that corner at that time, but the music got closer and closer as it passed, and then it went away. As so you can imagine, like the passage of this vehicle, but you can't actually see it. And it was only around about that point that she probably remembered, oh yeah, Dad's not with us anymore, But she clearly heard this music coming from a road, coming from the sound of a car, go right by the building. So, I mean, in the book, I obviously tell the whole story to give you a flavour of his character. He was, like I say, one of those guys that you either loved or hated, really. A lot of people were turned off by his very... He was quite loud, just to put it mildly. He was quite loud, and he couldn't have a quiet conversation. He just couldn't do that.
It was impossible.
Yeah, a lot of the old school Cockneys, they speak from quite deep down in their voice box, I think.
Right.
So yeah, I think so. It's you're only supposed to blow the bloody doors. It's a lot deeper.
So one that happened to you directly, you call this one the Grenville ghost.
Yeah. Again, I sort of tell the whole story of how I got involved in it. So I'll try and cut up and down. So briefly, I was looking for a place. I was renting out my flat, my holiday flat, in this same area I'm in now. It was because we're right on the coast. It's a beautiful area, and I had the bright idea that I would make a bit of money if I hired it out to holidaymakers as you know, I was traveling back and forth to America anyway. But it was a little bit more successful than I'd envisioned, I suppose. So when I came back, I wasn't always able to go into my own place and use it. So I needed somewhere. I needed like a little, just like one room really. So I was chatting to a mate, and he said, "Oh, my son lives in a place called Grenville," and I knew of the place, but had never been inside it. And it's on a little lane, so it's very near the sea, by these cliffs and these fields that run up sort of upwards towards the cliff. So you can't actually see the sea from there, but it's literally just like, I don't know, maybe 10-minute walk across the fields. And it's pretty remote. It's at the beginning of this very, very narrow lane where you can only get one vehicle up at a time. And, it's sort of thatched cottages around it and all sorts. It's very, very rural, and no street lights, nothing like that. And there was a lot of young people living in this place. Now, obviously, I'm not young. And his son was basically like overseeing this place as a sort of, it turned out to be, there's a lot more to this, but it turned out to be he was running on behalf of somebody else who was traveling, a guy called Jesus, believe it or not, who basically did look like Jesus, but Jesus we all know from the paintings, and the white Jesus.
The white Jesus.
And,
Okay.
the white one. Anyway, it was like one of these sort of, the real owner was renting it to somebody else, and then he was doing it to someone else, and so on. It was coming down the chain. And he basically had a couple of spare rooms that he could let me use for a nominal amount a month, not very much at all. And there were shared facilities like shared kitchen, bathroom, this sort of thing. And it wasn't too bad. It sounds awful, but actually it wasn't too bad. And it sort of gave me a sort of almost like a second childhood in a way.
Kind of like a college dorm kind of experience.
Yeah, yeah. It was like almost like Porky's or whatever it's called. Yeah, they were incredibly funny.
I didn't know Porky's made it over there to the UK.
Yeah, not quite the same, but
yeah,
it's but they were a lively bunch. They were all either surfers or rugby players or both, and they're very, very generous people, very funny, very, very funny. And I couldn't cope with it all the time because I'm 59.
Right.
And sometimes they'd actually have parties that went on till sort of literally 5 o'clock in the morning. And they did warn me about it and sort of gave me a chance to sort of get out for the evening or whatever, So it was quite an interesting place. But the room I got given, which was all in a hell of a mess when I got it, I had to sort of clear it all out and paint it. Had a fantastic view from a balcony. And it was a very lovely place, but very small. But I had everything I wanted in there. I could just, make myself a cup of coffee in there. I could sit and watch videos and whatever, and read. So it was ideal. But I knew that somebody had lived in there before, and I knew that this person had been a surfer. But I mean, a lot of them are anyway there because it's right on the coast. It's a surfy place.
Yeah.
And, the clues were in the way it was decorated. It had like driftwood and sort of beach stones everywhere and pictures of surfers and all this sort of stuff. But I cleared all that up, and but I kept a little token piece of it. I think it was stones or something. There was something I kept because somebody had said to me, "Well, you really ought to just leave something there," because I didn't know this at the time, but it gradually came to my attention through people talking to me, independently of each other, that this guy who we called Scatman, or they called Scatman, had lived in this place, and he died young. He died at 45. And he was what they say, imbued, one of these really popular people. They call him a legend. He was a legend, as they say. And I might possibly have met him before, but I wouldn't have known him by name. Sure. When he was alive. I wouldn't have known him. But it's very likely I did, because I did surf for a while. I surfed for about 2 years. So it's possible that, he would have been within a few yards of me.
Is Cornwall kind of like the surfing center of the UK?
One of them. The one everyone knows is Newquay. Newquay is where all the Aussies come. When the Aussies come to Britain, they automatically head to Newquay.
Okay.
And then they realise that the best surf is actually outside of Newquay. It's, there's all these sort of private places that the surfers know about. And nobody, the tourists don't know. You have to be in with the surfers to find out where they are. They're jealously guarded, some of the best places.
Right.
And a lot of those places were around Bude. Probably more so than where I am now, actually, in the far west, but that was on the north coast. So anyway, I used to hear these stories. People would tell me, they'd sort of say to me, because they knew I was in his room, because a lot of these people had actually lived with him, and a lot of these people were his friend in life, And all these stories kept coming to my attention that people had actually experienced this guy. His real name was Simon, by the way, I should say that. They had either sensed him or they'd actually seen him. And this had happened a lot. Now, there were 2 cases, my 2 sort of favourite moments of that were, one of the guys, he was a guy that run sort of raves and things, one of those lads who had been at this place at some point. And his girlfriend told me his story, and then he sort of confirmed it. He had been, shortly after this Scatman had died, a month or so after, he'd been walking up this long lane towards the house, Grenville, and he'd been in his, sorry, I'm mixing them up, that's the other guy. He'd been driving up there in this white van, and he'd seen a guy on a bicycle. And what you have to realise is this is a very, very narrow lane, and in Cornwall, these lanes they have what we call Cornish hedges at the side, which are not actually a hedge as you know them. They're a bank. They're an earthen bank that rises up above the field by about, could be 4 foot, could be 5 foot, could be more, could be less. And they're covered in vegetation, just wild. And then on top of that, we've got a hedge, or sort of smaller trees, mostly. And they tend to make tunnels if they're not looked after. So these lanes are very dark. And obviously at the early hours of the morning, which this was, no street lights, just his headlights from his van. He sees a bike. He's wondering who it is because, there's only so many people live in that tiny remote area. And, to be in that area, you're going to be living there probably at that time of the morning. So he slows down and goes around him to his left because we obviously, we drive on the other side anyway. But there's only like one carriageway anyway. And he looks over and he's shocked to see that it's his old mate that died. But this all happened so quickly that by the time he's sort of registered that fact, he's gone past him. But he was travelling slowly anyway, so he checked his mirror and there's nobody there.
Yeah.
So he sees him on the approach, he sees him as he passes, but then he's gone. Now, I'm not sure which happened first, I'd have to double check, but another guy, a guy called Stell, he's a surfer, very, very good, and a lifeguard, works on the beaches, and he travels all over the world. He's overseas now. They all do, They spend their life surfing. It's more than just, they live for the surfing, and they stay imbued for a while, earn a few quid, and then they go off traveling. That's their life, He was. Now I'm trying to think what he was doing. Was he walking or cycling? I have to try and remember. Yeah, he was walking. So he was walking up the lane, and he was in more or less the same spot when he heard a bicycle coming up behind him. Sort of quite quick, he heard that sort of swishing sound. So he threw himself into the bank, sort of back first, to just get out of the way, because it's a very narrow lane, And then he sort of obviously looked back to his left to see who it was. And there was no one there. So the next thing that happens is he feels this sort of, I forget how he explained it, but he said like an energy went through him. And as it went through him, he more or less instantaneously thought of his mate, Scatman, and he was smiling. And he hadn't been thinking about him at all up to that point. He hadn't been walking up the lane thinking about him. It was just like it suddenly came to him at that moment. And he's pretty convinced that it was him. Basically, just, spooking his old mate, I suppose. And there were several cases. I mean, I didn't put it in the book. I don't think I did, but I was sat in I put a piece of it in. I was sat in the room one Saturday night. They said to me, "Oh, do you want to come out for a beer?" And they were all going. And for whatever reason, I didn't really feel up to it. I said, "No, it's all right. I'll stop in tonight. I'll be fine." And I was the only one there. So it's a large house, quite a large house with multiple rooms. And it's quite creepy because by this time, I think I'd heard all the stories as well. And I had my own tiny room upstairs, and I could hear movement, and I could hear movement coming right up to the door. And I mean, I didn't put this in the book, but I actually because I've been talking about this to Janice, actually. And she said, "Well, just talk to him as if he's there." Right. So if you feel he's there, talk to him and just tell him that, you're going to respect his room and you're aware of him, and, just talk to him like you would if he was alive, if he was one of your mates. And I found myself doing this. And I felt a bit silly at first, but I could definitely feel there was something there. There was definitely something in the room with me, but I couldn't see it. And it wasn't creepy. It was just normal, you know. And
Yeah, you
after a
could
while,
feel the
that
presence, and it didn't feel
yeah.
like it was malevolent or evil.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
No, it definitely wasn't malevolent. It's a very friendly presence.
Right.
And I mean, I really can't sort of. I'm probably better at putting it all down in writing, but there's so many people who have experienced this. I mean, I think I probably got most of them in the story, but they all experienced different aspects. Some actually saw him. They claimed to see him. I think 2 or 3 of them did. And he was dressed the same way that they knew he did in life. You know, he was.
Right.
I'm trying to remember now because I didn't know him in life. So he had. I think he used to wear what they call board shorts, which are like surfboard shorts. And trying to remember now. I think he had brightly coloured shirts, and you know, he had this big hair as well. That was the thing they all told me. He had this big, crazy hair.
And but in life, he was kind of like the life of the party type of guy.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, there are videos. You can actually go online, YouTube, and if you put Scatman, you can actually find him on there. And he actually does. He talks. They had the BBC down there some years ago, talking to him about surfing, and he's just basically. You could see that the guy was full of life and passion for life. He was just like a really sort of up sort of person. You know, he wasn't. You know, he wasn't low key or anything. He was quite cheerful, and there's another video on there when he actually died. They had a memorial for him. And they had a big circle of surfers out in the bay. And they do this every now and again. If a surfer dies, they will give them this honour. They will all the surfers will turn up and they'll have a big ring. And they did that for him, and he had a huge turnout. I mean, off the top of my head, I think there was about 100 surfers in the sea who basically turned up for that event. And the local lifeboat went out there and put a reef in the water and all this sort of thing. And I mean, even that ties into the folklore because they did the Oggy thing, which I don't know if you're aware of, but that's like, you know, that thing about the three, you know, which crops up again and again. That comes from old Cornish folklore. It's like you'll hear it wherever there's a Cornish rugby team. You know, so you have like a caller who says, I can't really do it here because it's not the place. But
you're gonna wake everybody up if you do it.
I don't want to wake everyone up, but it's like one of them calls out Oggy. No, I'm trying to think. Oggy, and then the response is oi, 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 and then he goes Oggy, and they go oi, oi, and I don't know. I probably got it wrong, but it's like it's a chain, and it goes really, really loud. It gets louder and louder. And it's like they use it as like a sign of respect, and it's like old folk. It comes from like way back, you know.
When you when people were having these experiences, when you felt that too, how long had it been since he had passed away?
Oh, he died in 2012, I think it was, and this was 2017, 18, probably 18, I think.
Right, so in general, not too long.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these people were actually still, you know, to a slight extent. I think some of them were still quite, you know, you couldn't really talk about it because they were quite upset. You know, they were still quite upset. He was a very popular man, you know?
Right.
And he was just, I don't know. I mean, I definitely felt him in there, like that presence of it.
Yeah, like he was like watching the house, almost like he's kind of like a house spirit or like a guardian spirit in some kind of way.
Definitely. I mean, one of the girls, I'm trying to think, Vicky or something. She said to me quite early on when I got there, she said, "Have you seen him yet?" And I was like, "Well, who do you mean?" And she said, "Well, Scatman, have you seen him?" And I said, "Well, you know," and by this time I'm sort of getting bits of information from different people. And I said, well, no, I haven't. And she said, "Well, be patient." She said, "He'll turn up. He'll check you out." And I thought, oh, she's just winding me up. You know? But when I look back at it, there was a morning, I think possibly the second day that I was there, and I was stood in the kitchen downstairs, and I was looking at just doing a bit of washing up, looking out the window, and it's like a caravan site, like a camper site, just behind the wall. And I was watching these. I think I was watching squirrels or something. I can't remember now. But I was just sort of daydreaming while I was washing up, sort of quite early in the morning. I'm not talking about overnight. This is like 10 o'clock or whatever.
Right.
And there's suddenly movement at the back door, which is to my left as I'm standing there, about, I don't know, a few yards away. And the door opens. Well, I can't remember seeing it open, but I remember this guy walking in. And he basically just said, all right, or something like that. Just like that. It's just what people say, all right, all right, all right, And I just was just busy doing what I was doing, and I just went, all right, mate, and just carried on. I didn't really pay him much attention. I just smiled, said, all right, carried on what I was doing. And I made the assumption without, wasn't that bothered, but he'd gone over to my right. So where I'm standing, he's come from the left behind me. He's heading over past me, behind me. And over that way, when you get through the kitchen, there's a flight of stairs in the middle of the house, which takes you up, obviously, to the bedrooms, where his room was, where my room was, that same room. And the guy that was running the place, a friend of mine called Niall, he was possibly, and I don't know this for sure, he was possibly still in his room, because occasionally he would just sort of lock himself away in his room and watch rugby or whatever, and wasn't always up that early in the morning, And I just assumed that this guy had come to see Niall or somebody else who might have been up there. And because people were coming and going all the time from this property, it was a very lively place. So you had about 8 tenants, and all of those tenants had their own groups of friends.
Right.
And most of those groups of friends all knew each other. So it was just like a big social club. And everybody was friendly. If you weren't a friend when they walked in, usually, apart from this occasion, if you weren't a friend when they walked in, you were when they walked out, because they were nice people, good fun. And very welcoming, But on this occasion, this guy, I think he just went upstairs, but I didn't see him go upstairs because I was just busy washing up. But when I look back, I often wonder, I mean, I don't know, but I often wonder if that was him. Because I've had these, well, all my life probably, I've had what I call walk-bys, where you'll see somebody walk by you and you'll just make the assumption that they might look a bit unusual, as was the case in a couple of cases. But generally, they just look like a normal person. But they've got something about them that says they're not, but you can't quite put your finger on it. So being curious, you look around, you look over your shoulder after they've gone by to have another look. And quite frequently that has happened. That's happened a few times to me. They're not there. So I suspect that's what he was doing. Whether they knowingly do it or not, I couldn't tell you, but I think that's what happens.
Or you just are able to pick up on it, whereas other people aren't, possibly.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people can, and a lot of people probably don't even know they can. If they saw something like that, and then they probably think, oh, I imagined it, and write it off.
Or they just think that must have been some person. I want to talk a little bit let's talk about this owl story.
Yeah, sure.
This was super interesting, and a little bit of the shades of the Mike Cleland material here too.
Yeah. I mean, well, where should I start? My son Dexter, he was in a band. He was still living at home with me at the time. I think this was about 2015-ish, sometime around then. And I dropped him off earlier in the evening. So I was living in Bude. He was going to a place in a village called Stratton, which crops up in this book quite a lot, as you probably noticed, because of a battle and various other things. Mm-hmm. So I dropped him off, I think, from memory, about 7:30-ish, something like that, and dropped him off with his guitar and his little bass amp or whatever. And basically the deal was, because I did this a lot in those days, because he didn't have transport. He was too young anyway. And the deal was I'd come and pick him up later. But because I had to get up early in the morning, I basically said to him, well, look, don't make it too late. So we had that arrangement in place anyway. I dropped him off, went back home, and I was half watching telly and half reading a book at the time. And I was sort of fully aware that at a certain point in time, I think it was 10:30, 11, something like that, I would get a call and I would go and get him, and that would be it. So I was alert. What I'm trying to say is I was alert. I was not, I don't think I was tired. So I was just alert because I knew that I had to be alert, because I knew I was going to get a phone call and I couldn't sort of afford to relax too much. So I just sat there reading and watching the box, and I get a phone call around about 10:30, and it's Dexter, and he says, "Oh, Dad, can you come and get me? I'm ready now." Not a very good impression. So I said, "Yeah, I'll be up there in a few minutes." And this is a weird bit. It's difficult to explain. I hope I've explained it properly in the book. So I've literally just said, "Yeah, I'll be up there in a few minutes," and I hang on. So this was like in the house phone, I think. So I then, unknown to me, somehow I've fallen asleep, which is just the weirdest thing, because, I mean, even now, I'm 59 now, and I still don't do that. It is unusual.
But you hadn't done it before, you haven't done it since. Yeah.
Sorry?
You haven't done it before, and you haven't done it since.
Well, I've done it once before. I did it once before many, many, many years ago. When I was about 19, which was in my first book. I did it when I was with my mates and watching a film. That was the only other time I've ever done it. And I fell asleep halfway through a film and then woke up sort of about 2 or 3 hours later and carried on the conversation exactly where I left off.
Yeah, I remember that story. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, I frightened the life out of them because this voice suddenly came from behind them. So, what? Because they just knew they knew I was asleep, but I didn't know that. I thought I just blinked, And so this is a similar thing as to what happened. So next thing I know, so from my perspective, I've just put the phone down and I've said, "I'm coming to get you," Next thing I know, the phone's ringing again, and I'm thinking, I've just put the phone down. This is weird. So it's probably him ringing me again to say something or whatever, So I pick the phone up and I say, "Yes," and it's Dexter again. And he says, I can't know his exact words, but it's like, and there was swear words involved, like whether, do you think you are, or something like that, you said you were coming up. And I said, "Yeah, I did," because I still don't know at this point that was like, I think it was 2.5, 3 hours earlier. And I said, "Yeah, I've just told you I'm coming up. Be patient. I can't get up with that quick." And he said, "Dad, that was 3 hours ago." And I checked my watch or clock or whatever and realised he was right. And I couldn't really believe that. Thought it was strange. So I said, "Okay, don't worry. Look, I'm coming up now." And I felt bad about it because he was basically, I think he was about 17 or something. And I'm guessing now, I'd have to work it out. But he was at a mate's house who would have been roughly the same age, probably still living at home with the parents, And this was now getting on for like 1-ish in the morning, I think. And his mate had actually sort of had to stick around, on a weekday when he had to get up in the morning with my son, outside, just being his mate, waiting for me to come and get him. And so I hurried up there. I went, it's not that far. It's probably a 10-minute run, but it's very, very rural again, And I went through this little village called Poffville, and basically there's nothing on the road. So I just got my foot hard down and I'm hoping nothing's around. And had a few near misses on the way up as well. Because the roads are so narrow, it's just like lanes, And I get to this crossroads. And when I get to the crossroads, I am wary of the fact that even though it's early hours of the morning, and even though it's a very, very quiet area with generally nothing on the road that time of night, there always might be something. So instead of just going straight out and turning right at this junction where I had to go, I had a quick look to the left first. Before I even got there, I sort of looked left first, made sure nothing was coming, and then went to go right. But as I went to go right, there's this owl stood in the road, well, what I saw as an owl. And it's difficult to explain it to anyone this hasn't happened to, but you don't think at the time that's too big to be an owl. You don't think that. You just think, oh, it's a big owl. And you deal with it, and then you think about it later. That's what happens. So it was sort of, well, it was above my bonnet. I never know what you call them in America. The front of the car.
The bumper. The hood.
The hood. That's the one. Yeah. That reminds me of the John Prine song where he talks about, when you're having a good day, there's always some pigeon that comes and shits on your hood. You've probably not heard that one. No. or some American president who has a personal war with Iraq, because that was the other line. So I went to turn right, and as I say, this thing's just stood there in the middle of a road, but you have to understand the scale of a road. The road is not that wide, but it stood in the middle of a road. So I couldn't pass it because I couldn't really go around it because there wouldn't be enough space, So I'm just sitting there thinking, well, it'll move. It'll see me, it'll move. And its head was higher than the hood, slightly, not hugely, but slightly longer. And it was, I suppose, I don't know, maybe 2 foot across the front of the body section. And I don't know, 18 inches or so, 24 inches maybe, something around the head. It was quite sort of short and stumpy, I suppose is a better way of saying it. And it just sort of sat there. And I thought, well, I've got to get it out of the way. I was in a rush anyway. And I don't think I beeped. I'm trying to think back now. But I opened the window and I hollered at it. I sort of basically come on, out of the way. And then it progressed. It just wouldn't react to me. So I tried raising my voice and I tried swearing. And nothing really worked. And it seemed to be a while that I was there. I don't know how, but it seemed to be a couple of minutes or so. And eventually it took off, but it sort of flew towards me.
Right.
And as it came towards me, it went to my right. So I'm sat there. We're sat on the right-hand side because we're driving right. And I've got my window open. And this thing flies past me and it's flapping its wings. It was an amazing sight. And you could literally see the feathers on the wings. You could see them sort of, and it was sort of staring at me all the time. All the time this was happening, it was sort of glaring at me. And it was still glaring at me when it flew past. Like it almost had its head to the right as it went past me. And I'm on its right, And all the time it was there in the middle of a road. It had like a sort of menacing sort of feel to it. As if it was, I got the impression it was like sort of hiding something. That's the impression I got, but I couldn't see anything. I could see around it, and I couldn't see anything. Just the banks of the Cornish hedge and the ditch and so on. And it sort of, I think it was moonlight. Yeah, it was quite moonlit. But as I went off to the right. This thing had already flown. I just hurried on down this sort of downhill part, and I went past the battlefield site, which is not that far away from there. In fact, that's the point about this place. If you go right, which I had to, there's a battlefield site in 1643 where hundreds of people were killed and horses. And then to the left of that, probably about a mile, you've got GCHQ, which has frequent UFO sightings. Some of which are in the book. So the whole area, and people have had experiences which again are in the book, in the village where I came up from to get to that crossroads. So it's, I think I say in the book, it's like a sort of paranormal crosshairs. It's like, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen around there somewhere, But anyway, went off, collected my son. Didn't really think much about it at that point. Picked him up. And he was a bit grumpy because I kept him waiting, understandably. and basically just making small talk. And I said, oh, I saw, when I was driving back, I said, oh, I saw an owl, a really big owl, huge, just stood in the road, and I told him about it. And he said, how big was it? I told him. He said, owls aren't that big, Dad, which was a sort of running theme to this thing. So it has a sort of almost like a comic side to it. And it actually wasn't until he said it that first time, but I actually thought, he's right. They're not that big, as far as I know, you know.
Right.
And then I went to see a mate sometime after, probably in the weekdays or a week later, you know, who also crops up in his book a few times because he has a few experiences. And basically told him about this. And he had, I think it was what they call the Observer Book of British Birds, which is, you know, like a reference book with just about every bird that is known to Britain, you know. And we sort of had a look through that, couldn't see anything, went online. And then we started sort of trying to figure out what it was. Could it have been a migrant that was, you know, blown off course? And we looked at all that. But there's like a twist to this, because at the time I was writing, well, I wasn't even going to put that in the book because I didn't really want to put my own stuff in there. I wanted to just rely on other people's stuff because I did my own stuff as much as possible, you know, in the first book. And I was trying to steer clear of that. And so I'm losing my, let me just take a drink.
Well, it's interesting, Marc, that you have this experience, and especially after having, I mean, it's obvious that you probably fell asleep, but it's unexplained why you probably did, and then you have this like missing time event, and then all of a sudden you see this rather unusually large owl, and of course, you know, that brings back the whole screen memory idea, possibly, but it almost seems like you had an encounter with something that was 100% real, because you didn't have any missing time or anything after that. But,
well, no. I mean, as far as we know, there was no missing time. Yeah. And the thing was, you know, I think, I mean, I know I've read some of Mike Clelland's stuff and I've listened to him speak many times.
Right.
And I do find all that fascinating. Well, that sort of comes back to what I actually put, because when I was writing this, I had no intention of actually putting this in the book. I hadn't even considered it. It was something, you know, when something happens to you and you sort of store it away and you sort of forget about it. That's what it was. It wasn't that important to me. I didn't think it was anyway.
Sure. You thought nothing of it at the time.
No. And I think about 2 years ago, we actually discussed this, I think, on here. And I was sat in Janice's place in Springfield, Illinois, and I'd been writing all day. And she said to me, well, actually, I probably hadn't been writing all day, but she said to me, are you going to put the owl story in your book? So I've been on this book for years. And I said, well, no, I had no intention of doing that, really, because they're not going to be my experiences, they're going to be other people's. And she said, well, I think you should, because, you know, it's a good story. Whatever it was, even if it was a real creature, it's a good story, you know. And she sort of talked me into it, and I thought, okay, I'll do it. So I started writing it all out, and eventually, you know, finished off a thing, and I thought, great, I'm going to have a rest. Fed up with typing, and I got myself a beer and sat down on a sofa, and I wanted to find a podcast, and I was looking for a podcast, and I did my usual thing, is like go to YouTube and just flick through, and I found Expanded Perspectives. The guys from Texas, and basically there was a little picture, you know, like I forget what you call it, like, which tells you what's on, you know, it gives you a clue as to what they're talking about. And it was a picture of like the typical sort of Whitley Strieber type owl that's on the cover. Sorry, alien.
Right. Yeah. The communion.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah. So the two of them alongside each other, and I just thought, well, that's interesting, because I've just been writing about this, my own experience, which I'd never really considered much before that. You know, it was just something that happened, and I'd sort of just followed it away. And I thought, I'll listen to that. And the first story they were on was something completely unconnected, I think, and I wasn't that bothered about it. And then they started talking about this guy who'd sent a letter in, who was from Texas, somewhere in Texas. And basically, he told them this story of how he'd seen this huge owl, how he'd been driving down a country lane. And I'm not American, and I've never been to Texas. I never had that image of Texas that they'd actually have country lanes. I thought that was a very sort of English thing, Cornish thing.
That's a lot of country in Texas.
Yeah.
It's pretty big.
Country. Texas is huge.
That's right. I sort of learned that after the fact, but I was fascinated because his description was almost exactly the same as what happened to me. And my initial reaction, which was so, again, it's just that instinctive burst, knee-jerk reaction, is, how did he get hold of my experience or something, And then, of course, as soon as I said it, I thought, well, yeah, it probably does happen to other people as well, And then I sort of knew, and I sort of started looking at the Cleland stuff and seeing that, yeah, it does happen all the time.
Well, Marc, let's talk about things that have happened to others and things that have happened,
sure.
folklore there. And
well, something I wanted to talk about, I really like Chapter 6, the Buttes ghost trains. I thought that was interesting because you kind of almost have this this bridge to another time that people saw, in addition to not just a figure or something like that. People actually hearing trains, and I guess there was people who lived on the former side of this railway station.
That's correct. Yeah. This came to me from a lady. She, I can't give you a real name, but I call her Petra in the story. And basically, I think she had been there. So they're like retirement bungalows, I suppose, quite small little units, and they have like a resident or caretaker, carer sort of on site. And they're literally on the site of where the railway station once was. And it'd been there for a long time. I think probably for almost 100 years, the railway had been there, maybe more. And she'd experienced things. She'd sort of woken up in the small hours and sort of heard noises of men shouting at each other, which, you could say, well, it come from anywhere, but it's a very quiet area. There's a rugby club to one side, which closes at sort of midnight or whatever. There's no reason for any men to be shouting or anything down there. And she said it sounded like she could hear like whistles and stuff and people shouting, and she said it was like the sounds of a railway station. And she also experienced people. So she'd be sitting in her little retirement bungalow with like a tiny bay window and sort of facing out, watching. It's very quiet. There's no one about really, just her neighbours. They're mostly inside. And she would occasionally see people walk past the bungalow who were sort of dressed in suits sometimes, and they would just be walking off sort of from left to right. And she would think, well, that's sort of quite strange. And being a sort of a curious older person who, Kurt Twitcher, we call them, she liked to know what was going on in her little area, who's visiting who. And so she would jump up and go, look out the window, and this person or persons, they just wouldn't be there. And they wouldn't have had time to get to anyone's door or whatever, And that happened a few times. And then two new ladies had sort of joined this little estate where she lived. And they'd got talking, and it turned out that these other two ladies had had similar experiences. And one of them had actually asked her, because she was new to the town, she asked her where the railway station was. And basically, because she'd heard all the same things, and she just assumed that it must be somewhere around, she wanted to know where it was for future reference. So the lady who'd been there longer basically said to her, well, look, there hasn't been a railway station here since, I think it's 1966. And they took it, they demolished it all, and it was actually on the site where we're standing. It was all around here. And so, I mean, in the chapter, I sort of muse on how that whole thing works. I mean,
right.
We gave it a lot of thought, and I probably can't put it over. And it's better to read it really, but we went into all the ideas of how the actual motion of steam engines.
Yeah, electromagnetic energy or telluric energy.
Yeah. And if you imagine that, that's, hundreds of times over a period of, thousands of times, and that sort of electromagnetic thing going on. And that maybe emotions can run down these lines, because there were other railway hauntings associated with this one.
You have strong human emotions, people coming and going, people being reunited and separating, and almost like a lot of the same feelings that would be around a place like a cemetery or something. That's
right. And we also looked at the fact, when I say we, I generally mean me and Janice, because we, as you know, Janice is really into this stuff, and she's the one you want to be talking to, really, but she won't do public speaking. She is amazing. She's got so much knowledge of this stuff and has had, so much experience of it too. But we were talking about the very nature of a steam engine, for example. And my father was a steam engine driver back in the early 50s. And he used to often say, they're living beings. You do realise they are, and I used to think I think he was just being sort of dramatic about it, but I don't think he believed that they were, like the animists. The animists, they think that buildings, cars, trains, whatever, stones, trees, they've all got spirit. And I tend to believe that a bit more than I used to, actually, now. I'm sort of heading that way.
Right. Well, interesting.
But we were talking about that. And then, of course, there's the correlation, like something not even King doing Christine.
Mm-hmm.
You've got that possessed car, So I think the engines...
Let me ask you this. I want to ask you this real quick, because we're going to segue this into the UFOs. But before we get into that, you mentioned this battle, and you talk about this in the book. And we went out. Surfiel went with me down to Chattanooga, to the Chickamauga battlefield. And anytime that you're in one of those like Civil War battlefields here in the United States, or any other kind of battlefield, you get a certain feeling when you're there.
Yeah, absolutely.
What's your thoughts on the influence of that English Civil War battle on the landscape? And
in terms of this particular place, I'll be honest, it's not actually that huge. I mean, it hasn't got a reputation like nationwide, like I think some of the other battles sort of further north.
Sure.
I think is it? Oh dear, I'm trying to think of the name of it. I'm not so big on what went on up in the Midlands and so on, but there were a few battles up there where they do have. I mean, there's a fascinating video on YouTube somewhere of which dates back to the actual program was made in the 60s, I think, and they're actually speaking to people who have experienced ghostly manifestations or whatever on these battlefields, English Civil War battlefield sites,
right?
But generally speaking, Bude, Stratton, it's more or less the same. It's very close. It's not mentioned generally. I mean, it's not. I mean, if you speak to people locally, unless they're really into this stuff, they don't really know. But I dug into it because obviously I knew people who were into this stuff and who knew more than I did. Like my old friend Michael Williams, who did my forward. He was the main man in what he would call the supernatural, and he was amazing. And he'd done a lot of work up there with mediums, and they had experienced a lot of stuff. Have you heard of Peter Underwood?
No.
He did the Gazetteer of British Ghosts. He was like probably the biggest name in sort of ghosts back in the sort of 60s and 70s. He was the authority on it.
Yeah, I just wondered the influence of the battle, and were you a place where so many men died, and all the emotions that are poured out onto that field, but the influence of that is like somehow opening up a gateway or doorway area, or whether or not the doorway area is already there and the battle is pulled to that position. That's something else that I've thought about in the past.
It could be that, depending, I mean, there's so many options, but it could be that the spirits of these people lingers, in the horses, which ties into that other experience I put in there about the guy that saw the glowing bull just come down the lane. Because this is all, like I say, it's all very, very close together, all of this stuff. not all of it. These pieces we've been talking about, well, so the Buddy song was not really connected, but the Buddy song, the glowing ball thing, the owl, GCHQ, all of these things are really, really close. You can get to all of them within like 15 minutes, from any one.
In addition, then if the battle isn't so much, what other kind of paranormal influences do you think make Cornwall a particular hotbed? Do you feel like it's more of a hotbed than other parts of the UK, or are you just tuned into and interested in this kind of just been your field?
I think really wherever you are, you're going to find your own little pockets.
Right.
Yeah, we do have a lot, and it's true. I mean, like if you speak to most people who are into this stuff in England or Britain, I should say, they will say number one is London. Anything around London, it's riddled with it. Number two is probably Cornwall. It is close.
Okay.
But if you lived in I don't know, Somerset or up north, maybe somewhere in Northumberland, you might say, well, in fact, I know because I've experienced stuff in Northumberland. So I think it's everywhere, but maybe there are, like if you think about, say, like where Timothy Renner is, around that area, he's obviously got a lot of it going on around there. I think there are little pockets of it, and then you've got like that Hellier program. You've obviously got a lot of weird stuff going down there. So I think it's everywhere. I do. I think it's everywhere.
Do you think that Cornwall is definitely a UFO hotbed as compared to the rest?
Yeah, I think it's definitely up there because again it comes down to this. I personally believe there's something. We don't know. Obviously, we don't know where they come from. I mean, for me, I would say not. I don't believe in the nuts and bolts thing. I mean, I did when I was younger. I don't believe in that now. I do believe there's sort of like parallel worlds, maybe some sort of dimensions. I know people say that's lazy to say dimensions, but what other way have we got to describe it? I don't know. So, there's like, if you imagine, the way I see it is, if you got maybe a flat circle and, you're right, you're drawing a circle and you could sort of run vertical stripes through it. And each one is a different reality, if you like. And I think where they meet, occasionally there can be sort of bleed-throughs. So, and maybe some beings are capable of, they're capable of moving from one to the other. Maybe we're sort of stuck in one. Others are just coming and going as they please. And I think we're only now becoming aware of that because people like Joe DeMere, and there's another guy in England, I can never remember his name, but he's doing a lot of research as well. But he's picking up these entities he's working with different, like mostly like water, and he's an absolute genius, this guy. I'll try and think of his name. But he's actually getting photographs of they look like fish, clearly not fish, but they look like fish-like entities, and they're up there all the time around us. So there's life forms that we do not see, because obviously we're in that 1% that we see, or less than 1%, I think it is, and there's other stuff going on around us all the time. That's how I see it. We coexist with these beings. We're only now, with the technology as it's moving, we're gradually being able to, in time, we'll be able to track these things and understand them.
Well, I mean, if you look at a dimensional idea of the universe, that there's different dimensions piled on top of ours, then yeah, I could see that. And
yeah,
I definitely think that things bleed through and come through.
Yeah,
I just think in some areas, and Cornwall may be one of these, or certain parts of it, that these entities, these supernatural creatures, can come through a whole lot easier, and maybe like the veil is thinner or whatever. The old cliche, but I think there's something to all that.
Maybe there's a couple of factors that play into it. You've got a lot of granite down here.
Right.
And I think granite, sort of traditionally, I mean, we know that with the Pleiades stuff, and that's granite. The Loch Ness Monster, that's granite around there. So the granite plays a part, and I think water. I mean, you know, a lot of hauntings, but I don't know, I couldn't tell you the exact figures, but a lot of hauntings take place near water or near electric sources, or, you know, sightings of UFOs and stuff. So there's a connection there as well, I think. And, you know, we have to think about time as well. I mean, you know, time isn't like a linear A to B thing, as I think some of us may think it is.
Yes.
I think it's more sort of concurrent, if that's the word. I'm not sure.
Yeah, the idea that everything is happening at once or already has happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the other idea, of course, another idea is Anthony Peake's idea, which is, you know, I'll probably misquote him, but that sort of the idea of the perpetual return, you know, where you're constantly coming back and playing the same, like almost like a video game. You're playing the same life, and that's a possibility. And then in those final moments when perhaps you're dying, and the glutamate or whatever they call it soaks in, or, you know, does that thing it does, maybe you relive your life, but it's relived in real time, in the time that, you know, what we have here. So basically, we could all be doing that now. You know, what we're saying to each other now may well not be happening now. It may have happened centuries ago. For all we know, this could be just my memory. You might not even be there. It's, you know what I'm saying? It's just like we've all moved. I just think it's far too complex.
Yeah. Yes.
We're always going to be guessing, aren't we?
Yeah. I mean, you could argue the nature of reality, I think, over and over and over again. Yeah. That's an interesting thought, an interesting theory. Was there anything that we wanted to ask about UFOs?
Well, it seems like GCHQ really has a big influence on the amount of UFO activity in Cornwall.
Yeah. Do you think there's something technological going on there?
Yeah. I've sort of come to that conclusion because I think their job is obviously to monitor. I presume they monitor Russia and China and whoever else. You know, they monitor all phone calls. They're monitoring us now just by saying GCHQ, zoom, they're in. I actually had an experience. I was talking to Weird, Wacky, Wonderful, my friend Shelley, my Welsh friend, and we were talking about all this stuff. And somebody came on the line. Yeah, we definitely had a lot. There was definitely presence on the line.
Oh, they pushed the wrong button.
Yeah, special guest.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway,
we'd like to say hello to the NSA over here on our end.
Yeah, we've got, they're part of it. They run it too. I think they are the top boys at this space.
They're a number one listener.
Yeah.
They get to hear the show before anyone else over Skype.
I will get some weird hits from Washington, D.C. of like several episodes downloaded at once. It does happen.
Really?
Yeah, I've seen it. I don't know what it means, but I've seen it.
I'll try and be serious for a moment. So there's certain beaches down this end of Cornwall where I'm now, down the far west. And as I say, I'm about a 10-minute walk from the sea on one side, and probably a 10-minute drive the other side to the sea, all the way around. And not quite all the way around. Not yet, not until the water dries. But there's, on these beaches, we have the latest fiber optic cables heading out under these reinforced shield sleeves, you know.
Yeah. And
they go out under the beaches and then along the seabed all the way to America. Not just to America, but down to Spain, North Africa, and just everywhere, really. And they're sort of privately owned, but some of them are government owned. And as we know, there's a link between the two anyway at a certain level. They all, you know, BT are in the pocket of the government, clearly. You know, because they let GCHQ monitor all these calls, you know. And every call that goes out in and out of this country, comes out of in and out of Britain, goes through those cables. So literally, it's all filtered at GCHQ. So it doesn't matter who you're speaking to. I could be speaking to, Janice in Springfield, Illinois, and I can guarantee that they will. I'm not saying they do, because there must be like buzzwords and people of interest, obviously.
Yeah.
And I hope I'm not on that list yet.
Well,
so whatever.
Mark, in the time,
and I think the UFOs monitor those places, is what I was leading to. The UFOs are clearly seen by many people, and people have weird experiences on the beaches.
Maybe they're watching
where
the
those
watchers.
cables are, even when they don't know those cables. Yeah. And we've had people sort of go out on fishing trips and basically have missing time. People who beach cast fishing. I think I've got a few of them in the second book.
So like
they have
podcasting?
remarkably similar experiences. Sorry?
Is that like podcasting?
No, beach cast.
Mark.
Okay.
In the time that we have left, I want to cover a couple more things with you. The Bodmin Moor, and especially the screams that are heard.
Yes.
Because there's nothing better than unearthly, disembodied screams.
Yeah. That was just a story that I sort of happened upon when I was sort of researching Jamaica Inn and all that. And I just thought, I can't afford not to put this in. It's just so creepy. And I'd have to sort of look at the story again, but I think it was two lads, wasn't it? I think. And they were camping, and they were in the middle of one of these old stone circles, which date back, 1,500, 2,000 years plus, I suppose. And they thought it was a nice little spot, nice quiet little spot. It's on Bodmin Moor, which is very, very creepy. And they basically had this very, very loud, unearthly screaming, screeching sound. And they were absolutely terrified of this. I think, I'm trying to remember now, I think one of them looked out of a tent, and there was just this big triangle above him, black triangle, I think. And they were so terrified that they stayed in the tent. And in the morning, they eventually got the courage to come out. They were so traumatized. And there were mutilated sheep by the tent. I think it was sheep. I can't remember if it was sheep or birds or something, but they were mutilated, and they were sort of unnaturally mutilated, which, crops up again and again, doesn't it?
Mm.
So
do they think that it was
in
that story? Did they think it was the sheep that was screaming, or they think that whatever was disemboweling the sheep was screaming?
No. They think it. Well, yeah. Do you know what? I've never even. It sounds stupid. I've never even considered it as a sheep. But I don't think sheep would scream like that, would they? I get the sense that when these things happen to them, and cattle and so on, I get the sense that they're somehow shut down anyway. Sort of what's the word? Restrained.
Yeah.
So that probably shuts down their vocal cords as well anyway. So I wouldn't have thought it's a sheep.
And people were also on that same moor. We're also seeing like ghost vehicles, or like they was like feeling that presence.
Oh yeah. It's the vehicles one that really, really sort of gets my interest, because I've had a couple of experiences similar to that, and I know people have had similar experiences, including my friend Michael Williams. He was a supernatural investigator from way back. He just died early this year, and people see vehicles coming towards them, and then they'll just they might just check their mirror and they've gone. They're just totally gone. There's a case of Michael where he was going back home one afternoon, and he was coming up this little country lane on the way to his own little cottage. He lived on the moor, and there was a little van pulled over into what we call a lay-by, like a little parking space. so he could pass. And Michael stopped, thinking he would let this other guy go first. And then when he looked again, it wasn't there. It's just completely gone. Nowhere it could have gone. So the big story, the one I loved, was from way back in the 70s, I think. And it was a truck driver from up in Coventry in the Midlands, his job was to move brand new vehicles from the Midlands of England down to, I think it was Falmouth in Cornwall, to a dealer. And he was just doing this regularly overnight. And part of that entailed going across a bit of Bodmin Moor, which is very, very high, very, very barren, and very, very creepy. But he'd never had any experiences up to that point, I don't think. And he was just driving along, and all of a sudden he sees an old-fashioned car. So this was in the 70s, but he saw a car that he felt belonged to, I think he said 20s or 30s. And he's heading down. So he was you've got to remember we're the other way around. So he was on the left-hand side of the road, heading down towards the west. And this car was on the same side of the road. It's on the same side of the road, but it passed him on his left, which it shouldn't have done anyway, because the left is just like bits of granite and fences. It's like you don't want to go there. You smash your car up. But this car went off to his left, and he couldn't believe it. He thought they'd crashed, you know. He said that it was full of young men, and it was an open top convertible, and at least one of them was standing up in the back, and he had a bottle in his hand like he was drinking. And I think he had a long overcoat on. He sort of picked up on the way they were dressed was old fashioned. He said they were singing. He remembers they were singing. And, he's reading between the lines. He was saying they were all basically pissed, drunk. And presumably that's how they lost their lives. But he saw that and basically kept it to himself. This was the 70s. He didn't want to tell anyone. He didn't want people to laugh at him, wouldn't believe him. And then sometime later, he swapped his job from being a lorry driver, a truck driver, to running buses, coaches for tourists and stuff. And he arrived, I think it was here in St Ives, at a coach station, and he saw all his new driver mates having a rest, having a fag, a cigarette, and a cup of tea. And basically they're all taking the mickey, the piss, whatever you call it, out of this new guy. So he gets out of his bus, goes over to see what's going on, and it turns out the new guy is telling them about this car that he's just seen on Bodmin Moor that disappeared. And because they're not taking him seriously, so he basically said, well, let him tell his story. And when he told his story, it was basically the same thing, the same vehicle. I think it was green. It was a green car. I remember that now. The same vehicle, same people. A story that, the experience he'd had. And that car had also been seen in 2 or 3 other places within, say, 10 miles.
Does anybody know has anybody looked in the archives to see if there was an accident that fits that description with 4 people, rowdy teenagers, apparently is what it looks like?
Yeah, I think so. It goes back to possibly, we don't really know, but it could be 20s, 30s, 40s, Okay. I think it would be in that range. I mean, it would take a lot of work. Maybe that's something I should do. I mean, it's feasible. There will be a record of it.
And does
sorry.
Well, does it happen? Because you hear these things happen recurring at certain times of the year or certain days. Does it seem to happen like that, or does it more happen just randomly?
I've not heard of it since. I mean, I originally read it in Michael Williams's Supernatural in Cornwall. It was probably the first book of his I ever bought in sort of the mid-70s.
Right.
And that's why I read it, and it's that's what I wanted to put that in the book, because it's always been one of my favourite sort of ghost stories,
Yeah.
And then, of course, as I started digging into it, I found there were so many others, I mean, I had a case with a motorbike that came up behind me, when I was in Northumberland, and it was there. I was watching it in the mirror, and it's this sort of slightly maniacal looking guy behind me, right up on my boot. And it's sort of quite unnerving. And I pulled over to let this thing go by, because it was a narrow lane. And it never passed. There was nothing there, but I'd clearly seen it in the mirror, and it couldn't have gone anywhere. And the more you dig into this, it happens a lot. This happens to people all the time. So, are they playing out their last moments? Maybe.
Or is it a recording on the environment?
Yeah.
That's the other possibility.
Like you said earlier, though, I mean, if time isn't as we know it, then maybe that's still happening, and it's just, like you say, like a bleed through. Maybe, it's been said hundreds of times before, but like traumatic events leave their footprint or whatever,
Right.
Maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
It's all of the above, probably.
That's kind of what it seems like to me, is like a real traumatic event. And but we should mention this one too. There's another story in the book where guy's like an old airfield, and he hears some commotion going on that's like, sounds like it was straight out of World War II.
Oh, this was actually RAF David Stowe on the moor, and it's the highest. I think it's the highest airfield in Britain, possibly, probably, very likely.
So this is also on the moor too. So something about that area is interesting.
So that's a separate area, really, but separate to, it's quite near Bude, but it's not. It's probably 20 miles away. Bude isn't actually on the moor, but it's fairly close to Bodmin. So you've got Jamaica in. You've got the area where the cheese ring, I think it's called. Yeah, the cheese ring. That's where those lads had that experience with the black triangle UFO, and the screaming. And the bug ghost vehicle, at least one of them was up there. You had a case of the two chefs who worked at Jamaica Inn driving home towards Plymouth, which is quite a drive, across the moor first. And they came charging round a corner, and there was a guy hanging from a tree, actually in the road somehow. I don't know how that worked. He was hanging, and they clearly saw his face. They saw that he had a red neckerchief, that he had big boots, like like above the knee, like sort of pirate type boots, And they could both clearly describe it, and that was like a really pretty terrifying thing, with an accompanying bad feeling. They felt that. Even though they were driving through quite quick, they felt that. They felt the fear of it. Bodmin's full of it. Sorry, what were we on just now before I digressed?
Oh, well, the experience that the guy had at the old RAF base.
Oh, yeah. It was actually a lady. Her name was Prudence Pepper, and she'd come from London. After the war, she'd been an ambulance driver up during the Blitz, the German Blitz, and she'd sort of basically decided to get away from London to sort of rewind her batteries or whatever, recharge, and she ended up living in this little cottage quite near that airfield. Now, the airfield closed down, I'd have to check it, but I think it's 47, 48, sometime around there, and it had quite a few people sort of based there. We had Canadians were there. The Americans were there. I forget which ones, but the Americans were there. The Royal Air Force were there. I think the Polish were there at one point too. So it had a lot of different people based there, and most of their work was involved in like coastal command, they called it, which was like looking after the, rescuing people and attacking submarines, attacking the U-boat pens in Brittany. During the war, 42-ish, 42, 43. And, it was a dangerous airfield because it was so high. So the cloud cover would come down really, really low, and it would be difficult to, if they came back, they'd often come back limping after their excursions over Europe during the war. And they'd be struggling to get home. And then they might have bits of a wing hanging off or whatever, and instruments shot to pieces. And life was tough enough already. And then when they get back, they find that they can't see the runway, So they occasionally crash, would have a few fatalities there. So this Prudence Pepper, she was there maybe 10 years later, maybe a bit more than that. And she used to just go up there and have a look because it was abandoned. So it's a huge airfield with all these old buildings, which, the local ghost hunting groups regularly get pictures of like airmen in these buildings. You can clearly see there's figures. There's a museum there now, and that has activity in it as well. People hear planes all the time, like this Prudence did when she was there. She would hear planes as if they were trying to land, and then she would hear like the wheels hitting the tarmac. She would smell the burning rubber as they did that, and sometimes she'd see little flashes of light as if something had crashed. And there was like a cycle; it would just happen 2 or 3 times. And she used to go up there quite regularly and sort of see this sort of stuff or hear. She'd never see anything, she'd hear all this stuff going on. And as I say, in more recent years, the local sort of paranormal groups go up there, and I've been up there myself a few times. And, people do have experiences up there. There's a museum, I don't think I put it in the book, but there's a museum, like an RAF type museum. They talk about not just about the RAF, but about the Americans and Canadians, what their job was during the war. They've got all the exhibits and the photographs and so on. And part of the display are mannequins with like the Women's Royal Air Force. So it's like these very glamorous mannequins dressed in the old 1940s RAF uniform for ladies. And then there's the male one alongside it, I mean, they probably changed it now, but this is what it used to have. And they would lock that place up at night. And they would know exactly what it was like because they'd had this experience before. So they'd lock it all up, make sure no one has a key. And then when they go in the morning, they'd find that the lady's clothing had been removed. And various other things. So it could have been a practical joke. It's possible. But but people have heard voices in there. We've heard people speak to them directly, and there's no one there. And there's certain you'll find this in aircraft museum. Some of the older planes have got, presences. There's a Boeing 747 on the outskirts of London. Actually, I think it's Dunsfold, where they film Top Gear, and they use it in films like James Bond films and stuff. And actors and actresses don't want to spend time in it because there's a aircrew member who suddenly appears and disappears. So it's not an uncommon thing.
Yeah, I think it's got to do something with the expending of human emotion and what we can put onto the environment. I think it's very, very powerful.
Yeah.
And I think in a place like Cornwall that may be receptive to it anyway, certain people can pick up on it. Well, Marc, this has been a fascinating interview. I'm so glad to have you on. And this is not the last interview for this book because there's a second book. Yeah. And we're going to do one here probably about like a month and a half or so. But tell people where they can find both volumes of The Spirit of Cornwall.
Okay. At the moment, I've just got them on with Amazon. So any of the Amazons, UK, US, whatever.
Are you doing print on demand?
I basically just literally, I just keep a few copies, and everybody else just buys them direct. I don't buy 100 copies and just sit on them in the garage. It's just it's just direct. So, and I am planning to get them into Waterstones, and I'm trying to think of a name of the big American one. I can't think of it now. Barnes and Noble.
Barnes and Noble.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's to come. I'm intending to publicise it a bit more. I mean, I haven't really publicised it that much in Cornwall, to be honest, not yet, but I intend to. Because I think it's a bit of a crossover book. It's not just a paranormal book. It sort of crosses over into, I mean, we haven't really touched on that much tonight, but it goes into sort of the culture and the history a lot more. And I should impress upon, people that, when we're having this conversation, we're going back and forth, and it's all based on, I'm trying to sort of remember all this stuff because there's so much of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we sort of leap about a bit, but, like we do in conversation generally, but in the book, I should stress that it's more methodical. I run through the background to these things, and it's more easy to understand than perhaps it is when we're just having a conversation. But but hopefully it's where we're at.
We didn't even cover, I think, even half of what's in the book. So people, if you're interested, please get this book. And there is a second volume out as well. Highly recommended. I highly recommend Marc's books.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I didn't say that. It's called The Spirit of Cornwall, A Haunted Legacy. Don't just say The Spirit of Cornwall, because that is in itself a sort of nod of respect to an author who I was influenced by when I was younger, who used to write about Cornwall. That was his book. But I just loved the idea of using The Spirit of Cornwall because that's basically what I've written about in many different ways.
Right.
Not just in the terms, it lends itself to the ghostly side, but also to the actual feel of the place, the culture of the place, the history of the place. And then the haunted legacy is like my bit to sort of make that distinct from his. But it's also like an acknowledgement that, he's part of that in a way.
Kind of an homage.
So, yeah, that's it. Yeah. So, and as I say, volumes 1 and 2.
Well, very interesting. Thank you so much, Marc. Stay on the line for us. We're going to close this section out, guys, and we will be back to briefly close out the show on Conspirinormal. That was a good interview with Marc Anthony Wyatt. And we did another, 25, 30 minutes with him?
At least.
That we'll put up on Patreon at some point. So, Spirit of Cornwall, A Haunted Legacy. Guys, check it out. It's a good book. And like I said before, we're going to have Marc back on probably sometime in March.
For
is
part
what I'm
2.
thinking for part 2. And he is working on part 3 right now. And then we'll have him on for that too.
Yeah, he's just one of those researchers who really captures the spirit of place, and he's kind of becoming the Cornwall paranormal guy.
Yeah.
And also I think it's interesting because even though he has Cornish some Cornish roots too, it's kind of like his adopted place. And a lot of times people who adopt a place end up kind of not taking things for granted and become more interested than the people who are just already there.
Yeah, they feel more connected to it because they've invested in becoming a part of it.
Yeah.
I think that's how it can work for a lot of people.
It's something I can relate to. Then
same here.
Then kind of how what makes the Cornish different is that they're a more isolated group. And with these the more isolated groups are, and the more they've been able to withstand like really big changes, like they were kind of able to avoid a lot of the changes of the Roman conquest.
Right.
They have, like older traditions or things that are, a gateway to more antiquity than other groups might have.
Yeah, because they're very much on what was called the kind of like the Celtic periphery.
Yeah.
Because as the Anglo-Saxons moved to the east,
yeah,
they pushed them into Wales and then also into Cornwall.
So it's real interesting. And then the whole GCHQ is really interesting with why it's there, and I guess there's a lot of military history there in the World Wars, especially too,
right.
The Air Force.
Yeah.
But kind of how it has that unique security establishment element to it.
Yeah, there's a lot going on apparently in this small little peninsula that's not very big, not very wide.
Which might have been a good choice because of that.
Right, because you're kind of isolated.
Like an Area 51 here or something is out in the desert.
Correct. You've got several things going on. You've got battlefields. There's that moor area, which is always very odd and mysterious. And he mentioned something that I don't know if we didn't really hop on it, but there's also all the megaliths and stuff that are out there too.
Yeah, I was wanting to get around to that, but didn't really get to squeeze that in.
I think we'll get to that. Let's make a note to get to that for the second book, because I think he's probably going to talk about. So I think he does talk some about that.
Cool.
But that's another aspect. So you've got this like ancient culture that's there on the landscape. The English Civil War battlefield is interesting to me. Anything with battlefields is pretty interesting. Whatever is going on there, interesting thing about battlefields and something that I've been playing around with for a little while, and Timothy Renner kind of clued me in on this when we were at Gettysburg about almost 3 years ago now. This whole idea that battles can take place because they're pulled to a certain land or to a certain area, and that there's something about that area that causes it to happen. And then it's almost like a vicious circle, right?
Yeah.
A chain that falls back upon itself. So I find that one was, that's really interesting too. Just those concepts. And apparently it was a rather large battle that during the English Civil War. And so I think that has some influence. And then just the water that's on the other side. And we ended up talking about in this Patreon episode with him, we talked about mermaids, and we got a little bit into some stuff about the other and about fairy lore, and talked a little about Hellier too. And like I said, we'll have that posted up fairly soon, I believe. So you guys can check that out. Patreon. Please check it out, guys.
We should be posting something every week. By the time this comes out, we'll have one out on the Friday before this comes out, and then the upcoming Friday from when this is released, we'll have the bit with Marc.
Yes,
we'll try to have that be the schedule, that every Friday the main episode will come out Monday, and then every Friday we'll have a bonus Patreon.
Yep, we'll have a bonus Patreon, and right now that's as little as $1. But if you feel compelled to give more, please give more, because we do put out, trying to put out a really good product, and we've got hours and hours and hours now of material to listen to on the podcast, and there's hours and hours of material to listen to on Patreon too. And we're starting to do like little series where it's just us talking, and we're probably going to move that also to the main show. At least my goal, at least once a month, to have at least an episode where it's just me and Sergio.
Yeah.
Instead of like a guest episode, because I think that helps you guys get to know us better. So Patreon is there. That's patreon.com/Conspirinormal. Check that out. One-time donations can be left at the website at Conspirinormal.com. And YouTube videos, YouTube channel, please subscribe. We're close to 900 subscribers on that right now. That could help us eventually maybe get that monetized as well. And if you feel compelled, leave a review on iTunes. All that good stuff. One final note. This is episode 298. Episode 300 is coming up soon. This is pretty much a last call, because by the time we do 299 is posted, we will be ready to record episode 300. So if you guys are interested in joining us, we will be recording on February 4th at 7 p.m. We will be Central Time. Please hit us up. You can do that at Conspirinormal.com. You can do that at Conspirinormal@gmail.com. You can hit me up, Adam Sane, on Facebook and hit us up on Twitter as well. The DMs are open. So I think that is it. And next time we're going to be talking about flying humanoids. So join us then on Conspirinormal.
If you would like to help the show, please consider becoming a Patreon at www.patreon.com/Conspirinormal or leave a one-time donation at Conspirinormal.com. And please check out our YouTube channel, Conspirinormal Podcast.